Well, good morning. It is a great pleasure and an honor to be here. This is an outstanding panel. It's a little daunting as an academic to be talking to a room full of civilians. I have this new obligation to be brief, to be clear, and nobody has any need to laugh at my jokes. I also am doing this without any stagecraft. I may surprise you later when the flying monkeys come in, but for the most part, it's just going to be words and thoughts. My comments right now are going to be largely confined to the U.S. tradition. I've lived long enough abroad to know that traditions of journalism practice, institutional environments, and notions of obligation and duty among journalists differ very much, as do the rules of discourse. And I'm sorry for that, but it's taken me a long time to speak with any sort of sure-footedness about the U.S., and I wouldn't presume to do so about other cultures. I hope, at least, that what I have to say will be sort of valid outside of the state of Texas. So first, let me start by suggesting, I should say, that we have never had a body of ethical doctrine for journalism that was unitary, stable, and authoritative. And this idea that we're now seeing threats to a widely accepted and commonly understood body of duties and obligations is really false, historically false. We are the heirs to parallel traditions of journalism. Think magazines, tabloids, broadsheets, documentary film, partisan newspapers, sectarian newspapers, alternative press, trade press. All of them were practiced within different entities. They are often competitive. They often had incompatible practices with one another, conflicting normative traditions of engagement, truth-telling, advocacy. And it would be wrong for us to think that some were rogues, some were outliers, some were indifferent to ethical concerns, and others were the bearers of the truth. That's not the way it ever was, and so setting the stage for the situation we're in now, it's important to realize that a multiplicity and a fractured journalism environment is not a new thing. It is and has always been the norm. And you saw that in the way persuasive content was viewed, and the permissibility. The mainstream so-called press consigned persuasive content to opinion pages. Others saw it as an appropriate theme to introduce in reportage. Some documentary film allowed overt collaboration with sources, which many journalists would consider to be anathema. So all of these reflected different notions of engagement, different aesthetics, different aspirations when it came to effectiveness, quality, optimality, and they defined professional rights and wrongs differently and recognized different norms. As then as now, there was serious wrangling over expressive limits, sensationalism versus sobriety. There was wrangling over evidentiary standards. When do you have a story nailed down enough that it's publishable? You had dedication to different notions of public service. You had questions of what fair-mindedness required, what a willingness to submit to the discipline of empirical fact obligated the journalist to do. And this is the terrain of values on which the current conversation about ethics takes place now in the digital age. So, what shapes and reshapes ethics? Tom has, I think correctly, introduced technology as a major driver in the ethical conversation. And I'm going to talk about technology briefly, and I also want to talk about four other areas, again briefly, each of these areas has had and continues to have major impact on shaping and reshaping our notions of what reporters ought to do. First is audience enfranchisement. Secondly, industrial rivalry. Third, what I'll call revenue anarchy. And finally, institutional frailty. Now, the technology, we're going to talk about that a lot. I think I would just caution you, and I'm sure I don't need to tell my panelists, we want to be careful to not to blame the tools overly. The tools enable, they don't require. If conscious choices needed to be made to ramp up the velocity of the news cycle, digital technology made that possible. It didn't obligate legacy news media to waive or relax the standards of when something was adequate to publish. They did that because their marketing strategy obligated them, drove them, they thought, to be able to have credibility and legitimacy online. They wanted to stake their flag. They wanted to be the first, if not necessarily the best. Still, and the distinction as a result between conversation and publication is collapsing, and I think there's serious harms that are involved in that. We'll come back to that later. But technology does transform the ethical terrain. It creates new incentives. It creates new opportunities. Tools do confer obligations. You can't have should if you don't have can. When telephones were placed on reporters' desks, the failure to get comment from somebody named in a story became malpractice because it didn't require a 3-hour carriage ride to a distant suburb that would have caused them to miss their deadlines, part of a news cycle, itself an artifact of technology. Now you have reporters get inflows of emails, and what we should see and probably are seeing emerge is a duty to read them, a duty to listen, which is not something that reporters were ever admonished to do, at least in my many years in newsrooms. And maybe this vast expansion of communicative and expressive capability creates a whole set of obligations when it comes to aesthetics and quality and impact. Maybe we're getting to the point where a reporter, an ethical reporter, has to be able to avail himself or herself of a full range of technological proficiencies to be able to bring a story to the reader, to the viewer, in the most high-impact, most effective way. So in other words, the technology creates the tools, it creates areas of don't, it also may create areas of must. So much, we'll come back to technology. The second point I wanted to raise, it has to do with enfranchisement of the audience. And I'm calling this a selective enfranchisement because clearly there's a wider population of communicants who are involved in setting standards and asserting values now than had been the case 20 years ago. Now, I know every time there's technological change, particularly in the communications industry, there's a lot of millennialist rhetoric, there's a lot of atmosphere of celebration, there's a lot of talk about the expansion of communications democracy. We don't know whether we have a democratic regime arising or whether we're talking more of a populist one. And we don't know whether the influence of these other folks is limited to rare and colorful cases in which narrow enthusiasms are involved. Journalism ethics has always lurched from what Jeremy Iggers, an ethicist in Minnesota, calls officially recognized cases from one to the next. And usually the reason these cases get their notoriety has to do with the fact that people in influence within the industry want to make a point. Hence, Jason Blair became an exemplar of the rogue reporter. But recently, I've seen the Grantland case, some of you may be familiar with, where a transgender person was outed in the course of reporting and killed herself. And there was enormous, I was impressed by the passion and the sincerity of the outcry that surrounded that, which was very much an online phenomenon. All right, so third point, industrial rivalry. I just want to introduce the notion. The language of ethics has long been used as a weapon in the battle for audience and advertising revenues between rivals in the news business, and so it is now. The tabloid press in its day was deplored for its sensationalism. Upstart TV network proclaims itself fair and balanced, unlike its competitors. Ethical language used to buttress market ambitions. And now the criticism that legacy media are resting their authority on some discredited notion of objectivity, right, when practitioners need to disclose their preferences and predispositions, is a powerful criticism. And on the other side, the legacy press castigates the online rivals for cavalierly disregarding standards of verification in their haste to publish first. Well, my point here is that industrial rivalry avails itself of the language of ethics in order to pursue strategies. My fourth point, revenue anarchy. This is a big area. Just briefly, business turbulence has forced media organizations and individual journalists to make choices that traditionally would be considered prone to corruption. Right? The decline of the ad revenue model, search for philanthropic sources of support for media organizations has opened up the door to areas of influence over news agendas that the advertising support model rarely had to contend with quite so flagrantly. Native advertising and other mutant forms are rising. Paid placement is seeing a much more attractive option. And now we see the language of transparency abused, in my view, to mask that and to basically say that it's okay, paid placement, as long as it's disclosed, because everybody else who's communicating has ulterior motives too. All right, my final point, institutional frailty. I worry about the absence of, for the most part, and one of our panelists today is a happy exception to that, but the absence of new institutions operating in the news sphere that embrace their role as civic actors and have an interest in promoting the notion of journalists as professionals who recognize public obligation. I remember listening to Carl Bernstein saying Watergate was about a newspaper, not about a reporter. And I think that historically, professional ethics has been articulated alongside a claim for professional privilege, and it required institutions to go to the mat and to be the carriers of that doctrine. And I worry now, just my final point, the business trajectory of new age media organizations is short-term and transactional, and they're looking not to make a difference, but to make a killing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed.